Hello, my friends, and welcome to week number 2 of the Lifelong Fitness Nutrition is Life training series. I hope you're sitting down for this one. This topic that we're about to discuss is without question the most important aspect that I will teach in this series. And the reason that I say that is because controlling your blood sugar is paramount to controlling not only your weight loss, which probably about 90% of people that come into Lifelong Fitness, that's what they're seeking. It's not only paramount to weight loss, it's paramount to your health, your well-being, how you feel, your emotions, how you think, how you can concentrate. It ties into hormonal balance, intimacy. I would go as far to say as it taps into the way that you feel and process spiritually, emotionally, you name it. This topic is universal. And sadly, as a culture, we are living in a culture that promotes processed food that makes our blood sugar soar. And I hope to show you through this presentation just how important controlling your blood sugar really is. So why is controlling your blood sugar so important? As you can see in the graph over here, I'm going to bring my mouse into play here. High blood sugar equals fat storage, mood swings, insulin, spikes, as I just indicated, and the other things that I just indicated. All of these are brought into play when your insulin is high. So really controlling your blood sugar is the holy grail of health. As you can see in my bullet points here, weight loss is completely dependent on steady blood sugar. Now, think of what I just told you. Weight loss is completely dependent on controlling and steadying out blood sugar. We mentioned balanced hormones. When you have low blood sugar, you get cravings. I actually made an error here. It says high levels create cravings. This is saying low blood sugar creates cravings. Okay. What I meant by high is when what goes up must come down. High blood sugar encourages metabolic disease. Now, there is a reason for this as well. In your body, we're going to show you that there is mainly 3 places where you can store blood sugar. And when you are storing blood sugar in your second container, which I will describe here in a moment, and you continue to try to store more blood sugar and more blood sugar and more blood sugar, your muscles start to shut down. And when your muscles start to shut down, it leads to disease. Okay? Now, our next point here is that high blood sugar encourages yeast and fungal infections. It's estimated that about 70 to 90% of Americans are suffering from a yeast or a fungal infection. Now, the reason that this is important is because if you have a fungal infection, what does the fungus feed on? And the answer is it feeds on sugar. Okay? So high blood sugar encourages yeast and fungal infections, which create more cravings, which create also skin problems, eczema, psoriasis, autoimmunities. There's all sorts of things. Now, not the least of which, high levels lead to food addiction and sugar addiction itself. So we can see that this is, without question, something that is very important to understand, to really control our blood sugar. Now, I'm just here to tell you before we advance to our next slide, the average American does not control their blood sugar. 90% of us do not control our blood sugar. Now, even more sad is that most of us do not even know how to control our blood sugar. After today's presentation, you're not going to have that excuse. Okay? So I'm disarmoring that excuse. I want to discuss a topic that has been shrouded with myth. And the myth is this. We've been sold a lie. We've been told that carbohydrates are bad. And we've had these diets come out and say, oh, carbohydrates are of the devil. If you look at them, you're going to gain weight. They're just horrible to have. That is only a sliver of truth if it's talking about certain kinds of carbohydrates. But the fact of the matter is that not all carbohydrates are created equal. Different types of carbohydrates have different effects on your body. As you can see on my picture to the right here, this is an absolute truth. Somebody can have carbohydrates in ample quantities and look like the gal on the left. Somebody can have carbohydrates of the wrong type in ample quantities and look like the gal on the right. Okay? This is nothing more than a physiological reaction to a different type of carbohydrate. Now, fat deposition is highly dependent on that. Know this, even complex carbohydrates, now we say complex carbohydrates, these are more of the natural carbohydrates, they even have a higher degree of variability. Case in point, if I have a sweet potato versus a white potato, there is a certain degree of variability in how the carbohydrate is going to interact with your body. So now let's dive into that topic. What I'm about to share with you is the most important part of this presentation. This is your Glycemic Index 101 course. So what is Glycemic Index? Glycemic Index is a rating scale. It is a rating scale that breaks down and quantifies how fast a carbohydrate breaks down into blood sugar. Think of it this way. Everything that you eat, the piece of bread that you just had, the pasta, the soda pop, the licorice, the radish, the apple, all of it, regardless if it's natural or not, they all break down into blood sugar. I often tell my audiences when I'm lecturing that if you want to imagine carbohydrates in your body, their physiological function, next time you open up some bread, just imagine having that piece of bread soaked and sopping in blood, because that's exactly where that bread is headed for. Obviously, it might sound a little gross, but it illustrates a perfect point. And the point is that your body breaks these carbohydrates down either fast or slow. So the scale is rating how rapidly carbohydrates break down into blood sugar. Now there's three different categories to this scale. You've got low, medium, and high. Low on that 1 to 100 scale is 0 to 55. Medium is 55 to 70. And high is 70 and up. As you can see, there is a large variability. Now, in your client binder, in the back, in the nutrition section, you will find a section that has a breakdown of glycemic index listings. It's right there for you, print it out. This is a guide that will show you how fast these foods are breaking down into blood sugar. Okay? Now, there is a concept, a sister concept called the glycemic load. Now, the glycemic load is what I call, is said to measure real life. And the reason that I say this is because, let's think of it. In life, it's very atypical that you're going to only have a carbohydrate or a protein. For example, how often do you just have a Ritz cracker and call it good? How often do you have a can of tuna fish and just call it good? Now, sometimes that happens, to be sure, but normally we're mixing and matching foods. So what this is, it is a formula, essentially, as you can see here, and I'm not too concerned that you memorize this. You don't have to, don't freak out. What this shows is the glycemic index. Okay, I'm going to bring my mouse back into play. The glycemic index of a food, let's say it was cantaloupe and it was like 40, you would plug that in there times the grams of carbohydrate. That's what CHO is. Let's say that per serving you had 7 grams of carbohydrate, and then you would divide it by 100. Well, what that is going to do is measure the net effect of all the carbohydrates that you eat. So let's say, for example, you had cantaloupe, pasta, and some crackers. What you'd have to do with this formula is find the respective glycemic index of all of those, plug it into the formula, and find out where your glycemic load is. So you'd have to plug in the cantaloupe, see what that is, plug in the pasta, see where that is, and the other food that I just mentioned that I just forgot, and see what that is. Okay, once you find that, you're going to get a good idea of what kind of insulin response, because the glycemic load doesn't just measure how fast a food breaks down, it also takes into account how much you're having. I get a kick out of it because I have a lot of clients in a coaching session. They will have a smile on their face and they're very happy. And I say, what are you so proud about? And they say, well, you know, I just had this low glycemic pasta. And it's interesting because when they have the pasta, they had 3 or 4 servings. And what they failed to realize is that through their glycemic load, they had probably about 70 grams of carbohydrate. So even though the glycemic index was low, they still had a very high glycemic response. And that's the key. Okay? Now, let me show you. I know this is kind of a bad little graphic. This is pulled from your binder. There's 3 concepts to put this into layman's term that I hope you can make sense of. Bring my mouse back in here. You see up here, you've got concept number 1. What I want you to understand here is what I just told you. 1 piece of bread will do this to your blood sugar. See, it brings up, gives you a little bit of a insulin spike, and you come back to normal. 3 pieces of bread, look what happened to your insulin spike. You just doubled it. 5 pieces, you just doubled it again, and you're way up here. See, this is real life. This is why controlling portions from a blood sugar perspective is extremely important. We want to make sure that we're getting good sources of carbohydrates and that we're controlling the quantity. So we're looking at both the quality and the quantity factor. Now let's look at concept number 2. Concept number 2, it says celery mitigates blood sugar. And what I'm trying to show you here is that if you were to have a lollipop, okay, but you were to precede that with 3 large servings of raw vegetables, okay? Now think about this in real life. You go to a restaurant like Olive Garden. Let's say you have the salad before the piece of bread, the bread stick. If you were to have a large salad and have just 1 breadstick, what's going to happen is that the vegetable actually has a mitigating effect on your blood sugar. It will bring it down a little bit. Okay, so this is what you would get. You would get this small little boom. I mean, it's still going to come up. Now let's say you just have a small salad and you also have the breadstick, so represented by the lollipop here. Here's your salad. You're going to get a medium effect. Now let's say you just have a very small serving of salad, make 2 or 3 bites, but you have 3 or 4 breadsticks. Well, the vegetables at that point don't have the mitigating power that all 3 of these vegetables do. So therefore you get a high rise in your blood sugar, and therefore you have a high rise in your insulin. One key point here, where you have blood sugar, you have insulin. Right? Where you have, let me repeat it because this is important. Where you have blood sugar, you also have insulin. Insulin is your transporting storage hormone. It breaks down blood sugar and it stores it in your body. And later in this presentation, I'm going to show you where. Now here's the 3rd concept. If you have protein and quality fats, now get me on this, protein and quality fats, like anything that's natural. We're not talking processed vegetable oils and canola oils. We're talking like avocado oil, walnut oil, coconut oil, any kind of natural, cold-pressed, virgin oil that has not been refined is going to help bring down your blood sugar. Thereby, we're starting to see how this whole fat is bad myth is being crushed. There's no such fat is bad if it's processed. If it's man-made processed, then yes, it's bad. But if we have good quality natural fat, we see, given this diagram, that it's going to mitigate our blood sugar. We have our lollipop, we have some, let's say we had some salmon with that. This is tuna fish, but if we had like salmon and some natural oils in it, it's going to make sure that our blood sugar is regulated. Now, take down the effect, same thing, just have a little bit of fat, but you have a lot of sugar, you're still going to get this. A little bit of fat and protein, a lot of sugar, you're going to have high blood sugar response. So this is a conceptual way to look and understand the glycemic index. Now let's look at an example of the glycemic load. I love this, and you can just read along here. Remember, we've got different categories of low, moderate, and high glycemic load. Low glycemic load is less than 10. Moderate is 10 to 14, and high is greater than 15. Remember, here's our formula right here. So an example of a high glycemic indexed food, like a watermelon, but a low glycemic load. Remember, glycemic load is what you're really concerned about. 120 grams serving of watermelon has a GI of 72, and the available carbohydrate is 6 grams. So remember, up here, we have 72 grams of carbohydrate, or GI rather, so GI would be 72, and we have 6 grams of carbohydrate, which we would plug in here. Remember, minus the fiber. Fiber doesn't count. And by the way you can tell that is if it has carbohydrates, it will say net carbs on there. That's what you would plug in to the formula. Fiber does not count. Okay, so you would always have to take the fiber out. So if you had 30 grams of carbohydrate and 6 grams of fiber, you would have to take 6 grams out of your carbohydrate. Okay, so you would be calculating 34 rather than the 40. Okay, so therefore, the glycemic load of the watermelon is 72, that's your glycemic index, times 6 grams of carbohydrates divided by 100 is 4.3. That puts us right into the low glycemic category. I just said that wrong, glycemic load, pardon me. Now, here is the example of my client that I just gave. Here's an example of a low glycemic index food like pasta and a high glycemic load. 180 gram serving of cooked whole wheat spaghetti has a glycemic index of 37. The amount of available carbohydrate is 36 grams, which is 42 grams of carbohydrate minus the approximate 6 grams of fiber that we just talked about. Therefore, the glycemic load of whole wheat spaghetti is 37 times 36, so glycemic index times your glycemic load divided by 100, and you got 13, and you are approaching high. So technically it's the high end of moderate, but you get the point. It is a little bit lower on blood sugar impact, but because the serving was high and it's more carbohydrate dense, you get a higher glycemic load. Now, this is extremely important to understand because once you start to look at all of these choices, you start to say to yourself, well, how am I going to choose my foods? Okay. It doesn't mean you can't have the pasta. It doesn't mean that you can't have the occasional piece of bread. But if you are going to have a substantial blood sugar impact, well, you may want to think again, especially if weight loss is your objective. Okay? So let's look at some blood sugar laws. I stated a few of these. All carbohydrates minus fiber elicit a blood sugar response. Remember the blood example of the bread. Carbohydrates go down into your bloodstream. They break down into blood sugar. So if you had 120 calories, really what those calories are is energy units that are represented in your bloodstream. Okay? And you use those in an energetic transduction process metabolically, and you've got energy. Next law. Elevated blood sugar elicits an insulin response. What I just said, where you have blood sugar, you also have insulin. Now, insulin transports blood sugar into 3 different bodily containers. And we're going to see what this means. Let's keep going. Blood sugar and insulin are twins, just to reiterate. That's why it's so important to put in there twice. The higher the blood sugar, the higher the insulin. That's your glycemic load. The more blood sugar you are pouring into the system via the quantity of your carbohydrate intake will determine how much insulin you get. And that's why your portion control is so important. The higher the insulin, get this guys, the higher the fat storage. Your blood sugar is controlled by many key elements and factors. Okay? Those laws, if you just need to keep going back, you need to commit those to memory. You should know each and every one of those laws intimately. Those are, like I say, if you understand how to control your blood sugar, you understand so much. Now, we're going to go over the 3 containers. Now, this is a conceptual model of what happens to your calories. When you eat a carbohydrate, where do the calories go? Now, this would also transcend into carbohydrates and fat as well, but we're going to look at this in the context of the glycemic index. Now, come down here, see my little mouse here. We're going to look at this with 2 different scenarios. We're going to look at scenario number 1, where we have a glycemic index rating, eating white bread, of 90. Remember, this will break down fast. Versus, in scenario number 2, we have a sweet potato where it is 30. Next, our activity level on scenario number 1 is sedentary. Whereas the activity level on the sweet potato is physically active, we're exercising. Our nutrition in scenario number 1 is poor. So we're eating processed food, sugar, junk food. Processed food is junk food. Just let's come to terms with that. Processed food is not healthy. That's a hard thing to swallow, but it is very true. Now, there's a huge spectrum of what is a processed food. We'll talk about that more in week 5, but just know for now that this is not good. Okay? Processed food equals poor nutrition. Now, scenario number 2, we're eating clean. Now, here's what I want to direct your attention to. We have been sold a lie, my friends. We have been told that a calorie is a calorie is a calorie. Calories in versus calories out. Now, I'm here to tell you that's garbage. Both of these are 120 calories, so we're going to see what happens. Now let's look at the 3 different containers. Container number 1, right up here, is your small container. This has certain characteristics to it. In other words, this only holds about 6 to 10 grams. That's not a lot. And the reason that your body only holds 6 to 10 grams is because you have to keep your blood sugar in strict confines. The reason for that is if you go too high or too low, it's very dangerous to the body. And that's why a type 1 diabetic has to control their blood sugar so carefully. And if they don't, there is tremendous physical consequences. Now, the brain even controls it even more tightly. Okay, so the amount of blood sugar in the bloodstream, which this is your small container, this blood sugar, right? This is your veins and your arteries, more particularly your arteries, and then the exit is the veins. This can only hold 6 to 10 grams. You can't make this container hold more. It's small. Even if you're 10 grams for somebody that's like 6'5", maybe 6 grams that's for somebody that's 5'5". Now, other characteristic is that this is cleared by exercise. You can go and exercise and clear out your blood sugar, but the capacity is set. You can't stretch it out. It is what it is. So the second container is what's called the medium container or the glycogen container. This, as the graphic indicates here, is your muscles and your liver, and to a smaller extent your brain. Okay, this holds carbohydrates that have been broken down that are not utilized in this first container. So this is really essentially the spillover from here to here. Now the characteristics of this are drastically different. Instead of 6 to 10, now you're at 400 to 500. And it can even be a little bit less or more depending on the size of the person. But that's a heck of a lot more than this. Now here's the big deal. This is also cleared by exercise. This is why the athlete or the exerciser can go run a marathon and have energy, because they're drawing and extracting energy out of this second container. It's called glycogen. If you're a runner, you know exactly what I'm talking about. You go and you glycogen load. You are storing carbohydrates in your muscle for later. Now here is the big deal. This capacity becomes greater through exercise. When you work out, you create enzymes and you actually create physical space, more storage capacity in this container. Now that is a very big deal. Here's the third container, the fat container. Dun, dun, dun. We knew this was coming, right? It is inevitable. The characteristics of this is that it has an infinite capacity until you die. Literally, it will keep storing and storing until you get diseased and die. And it might sound funny, but that is the honest truth. This is also cleared by exercise. Obviously, we know that by people losing weight. And the capacity is set by fat cells. That's why when people go get liposuction, they are taking out fat cells. But what they don't tell you, the physician usually will not tell you, is that you only have a finite amount, a capacity that is set by a finite amount of fat cells. So if you take it out one place, it's going to go somewhere else. Now, with that preface, let's look at our scenarios here. Scenario number one, we're sedentary, we're eating poorly, high glycemic foods, we're eating processed foods all the time. Now remember, we talked about 80-20, eating 80% of the time, investing in wholesome, raw, nutritious foods. Most Americans live the inverse. They live the 20-80 rule, where they have an occasional vegetable, an occasional fruit, but most of their drinks are carbonated water, sodas, sugary drinks, juice, orange juice, really foods that are high in sugar and highly processed. So let's take you through this scenario, and let's break this down. Scenario number one. Remember, 120 calories. We're having a white piece of bread that is 90 on the glycemic index. Now, the question is, does that break down fast or slow? Well, it breaks down very fast. So where does it go? If it has 120 calories, it goes down into your gut. You start to break it down into blood sugar very fast because you have a high glycemic index. When the blood sugar comes into your gut and breaks down, insulin, where you have blood sugar, you have insulin. Insulin comes to the rescue. Insulin says, okay, 120 calories, you are coming with me to one of these, here's my mouse, one of these 3 containers. Well, if you're not exercising and your metabolism's slow, and you have 120 calories circulating in your bloodstream, you're probably only going to be able to store about 10 of them there. 120 minus 10, you only have 110 calories left. Only. So now, you come over to your second container, which is your glycogen container, which is cleared by exercise and made greater through exercise, but there's a problem. We're not exercising, and we're eating poorly. So what we're always finding is that we're always demanding this storage space. We're always trying to force calories into this space. But the problem is there's not a lot of capacity. There's only a 400 to 500 gram capacity. So it's like knocking on the door. Hello, hello, and there's no room at the end. So in this first scenario, I'm only able to store 20 calories. Okay? Well, where's the remainder of the calories going to go? Well, the answer is obvious. The insulin, therefore, has to take the rest of those calories and transport them into our large container, which is the fat container. Now, get a load of this. In our first scenario that we're describing, that would allocate 90 calories into this container. And that's why we step on the scale at the end of the year and we say, how did that happen? How did I get that extra 5 pounds on there? And you just saw it. Now, let's look at the second scenario. Now we're going to eat clean, we're going to be physically active, and we're taking foods in that have a low glycemic index and load. Here's our sweet potato. Since we're exercising, and since its capacity is set or cleared by exercise, and our metabolism is revved up through exercise, this first container is going to oxidize more, literally twice as much. And this is where you get this residual metabolic effect. A lot of people say, well, I hear about this like If you're exercising, you're burning more calories throughout the day? Absolutely right. The reason for that is because your body enzymatically, metabolically, is set and primed to break down food and fuel because you need to repair tissues from exercise. There's more of a demand for them. So instead of oxidizing 10, I oxidize 20. 120 minus 20 only leaves 100 left. Now here's the magic, and I need your attention for this. If I'm exercising and I clear this bad boy out through exercise, I'm making this bigger through exercise. When these calories come, when the insulin brings these calories over in the form of glycogen, it says, come right on in. I got room for you, rather than giving you the stop sign like you got in scenario number 1. Now you have the ability to store them, which leaves only 10 calories left. Now, if you're eating good, healthy sources of fat from the sources that we mentioned earlier, coconut oil, extra virgin of olive oil, nuts, all those kind of good fats, this fat that you stored is myelinating your nerves, it's building your heart muscle, which needs fat, it's creating saturated fatty acid structures in every cell of your body. So it's good, okay? This is the difference. You literally just had an 80-calorie difference because of your lifestyle. And that is why we stress lifestyle so strongly and so profoundly here at Lifelong Fitness, because it's only when you change your lifestyle that you change your body composition. You can never out-train a bad diet. It's impossible. People have tried, and it doesn't work. I'm here to tell you, it does not work. So, I want to finish this part by the 2 questions. These 2 questions are going to be the most powerful questions that you'll ever be able to ask. Because if you're fretting about, well, how am I going to know about the glycemic index? Well, there's, in your binder, there's a resource, one called Mendoza.com, where you can go and see the glycemic listings. Your binder has glycemic listings. Here's the deal. You don't need to really freak out about how much or what the glycemic index is if you're really asking these first 2 questions. Question number 1. Is what I'm about to eat natural? Now look over here in my little picture. This is a natural source. These are unadulterated foods. Now you could put whatever you want in this picture. Put an apple in there. Put celery in there. Put spinach. Put a sweet potato. Put rice. Put a whole grain. Put legumes, put lentils like there is there. Now over here, put whatever you want processed. These are highly processed man-made foods, loaded with chemicals, loaded with sugar, loaded with processed flour, which is going to skyrocket your glycemic index and your glycemic load. So the first question you always have to ask is it natural? When you go to the grocery store, you are going to have a very eye-opening experience as you walk in and you realize that at least 80% of the foods that you're looking at are not natural. They are highly processed. Now we've talked about there is a spectrum of processing. So for example, there is processed foods like a 100% whole grain cracker that would be appropriate every once in a while, right? It is processed, but it is a lot more natural. Sometimes the question isn't clear cut, right? And you're going to have to gauge it on the spectrum. Well, the cracker's been processed a little bit, but it is 100% whole grain, which makes it a heck of a lot more natural than a Ritz cracker or a saltine, which that is absolutely not natural. They're bleached, everything's taken out. That's processed refined food. You don't find that growing out of the earth. You don't see a Ritz cracker tree. You don't see a Dr. Pepper plant in your garden. It's just not natural. What you do see is fruits, vegetables, whole grains, meat, raw dairy products. You notice I said raw there. Yes, I did. All these things are more natural. We haven't processed them. The problem is when we start to process foods, that's where we get the problem. And we have to start to reconcile ourselves with this immortal truth, is that God made it right the first time. We don't need to say, thanks God, I'm going to take it from here and go process it, refine it, add sugar to it, take things away, put things in, juggle them around, put them through 25 machines, bleach them out, add color back. I mean, this is what we do. And it's not natural. So question number one, is it natural? And question number two is this: what is the glycemic index and the glycemic load? Now, case in point, why would you need to ask that second question? Let's say you're getting ready to go to bed, okay, and you're a little bit hungry, and you got two choices. The first choice is a potato. It's a white potato, and the potato is higher on the glycemic index, which it is. Second choice is salad, which has almost 0 on the glycemic index. So one of the choices, they're both natural. Question number one is answered by both of them. The question number two, you have to think, I am going to eat a food that will either have a high impact on my blood sugar, which is the potato, or a minimal, trivial effect on my blood sugar, which is the salad. And you got to be real with yourself, and you've got to ask, which one is more appropriate before I go to bed? Think of your 3 containers that I just took you through. Okay? Once you go through that, you might think twice. If you have that potato, there's a higher chance, because it has a higher glycemic index, even if you are physically active, that some of those calories would be stored. That would not be the case if you answer question number 2 here of the salad, because the glycemic load is very low. The glycemic load of the potato is higher. So become very well acquainted with these questions. Learn them, love them, live them, understand them, implement them. And it is a process. If you don't understand what the glycemic index of foods are, you just have to do a little bit of due diligence. Ask these 2 questions. Most likely, if you answer the first one, your second question is going to be answered. Most likely, if it is natural, you're going to be okay on the second question. The only time you really need to be asking the second question is when your primary objective is weight loss. You want to make sure that your glycemic load and your glycemic index is moderate to low at all times, so that you give your body a chance to heal. It is impossible, let me just be very clear here, it is impossible to lose weight and to stay healthy, which is more important than losing weight, by the way, and live a life of functionality and vitality without controlling your blood sugar. It is impossible. And we cannot, despite our best mental meanderings, get around this core, fundamental, immortal nutritional truth. That is the first part of this presentation for week number 2. I'm going to conclude in part B here. I hope you enjoyed this. If you have any questions, ask myself or your trainer, and I'd love to help. Always remember, never excuse away your inner greatness, and always remember, life is good.